Great. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm really excited to have this group of cybersecurity practitioners with me this morning, at least in a virtual space. I will do a quick. I will let them do a quick round of introductions, but we've posted their bios along with the webinar, so you know that this is a great panel. But I'll let them at least say hello. So, Jen, I'll start with you. You're on mute, Jen.
You would think after this long of doing virtual events, I would know better, but no. So I'm Jen. I don't know where my mute button is. I'm Jen Ellis. I'm the VP of Community and Public Affairs at Rapid7. I was a co-chair on the Ransomware Task Force with Michael. And thank you very much for including me.
Welcome. Happy to have you here. Jaya.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jaya Baloo. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer over at Avast.
Great. And Wendi.
Hi, everyone. I'm Wendi Whitmore. I lead the Unit 42 team at Palo Alto Networks, and I'm excited to be here today.
Great. So the topic that we're going to delve into today is really focused on practical cybersecurity, how to actually take what we as cybersecurity practitioners spout off about all the time and actually talk about how people can implement that in their, either as an individual or in their organizations at a more practical level to increase their level of cybersecurity. But the first place I want to actually start this conversation is, so what's the typical misconception about cybersecurity you encounter when you are dealing with non-practitioners, those that aren't steeped in the nuts and bolts of what we do? And Wendi, maybe I'll start with you on this question.
Sure, Michael. I think, one of the common responses I get, and I'm sure the other panelists do as well, is just about how exciting the job, must be in terms of conducting investigations, right, around attackers. And it certainly is exciting. The work we do is very interesting, but I think what's coupled with that is this idea that everything is so incredibly complex versus the idea that there's a baseline of best security practices that organizations can take that are really fundamental and foundational and probably not that exciting. Right? It's similar to, clients who talk about finding attackers and want to install these incredibly complex honeypots, for example, when they don't have two-factor authentication on systems, right? There's some basic things that we need to be focused on within the field. And so I think that is probably one of the more common misconceptions, is that maybe those things aren't as important as the newest, coolest tool for threat detection, for example.
Yeah, I always think of that as like the painting a room problem, right? The part of painting a room that everybody finds exciting is putting the paint on the wall, right? But the important part is actually, taking off all the light cover, light switch cover fixtures, what do you call it in Britain? The PowerPoint fixtures, right? And doing the taping and the detail work. That's what actually really makes the paint job look good. And that's the boring part that nobody wants to do. So I mean, that's a really good point. Jaya, how about you? What's a common misconception you run into?
I think the biggest thing, and it's a bit derivative of what Wendi just said, is that all attacks are advanced attacks. They're all these super clever, nifty, original, 0 days, massive exploits, and that's what led to these major compromises and data breach. And sadly, that is absolutely not true. It's the stupid stuff. It's the things that, of course, they should have had in place, understanding where vulnerabilities are, or not being clicking on a phishing link, or it's really kind of low-hanging fruit, common exploits that could have been prevented that really actually make the headlines, unfortunately, underneath advanced attack. It's about us being able to peel back the onion, even in these complex supply chain attacks, understanding how, we go back from this very big conflated thing to the original initial vector of attack. That's what's always kind of like a misnomer in the layman area. Yeah,
I always find it interesting that in media reports about cyber incidents, it's always, a sophisticated attacker, right? That's it. Nobody was ever hit by anything other than a sophisticated, advanced attack. Jen, what about you?
So I think a little bit the same as Wendi and Jaya mentioned, but I see two different extremes. I see either Oh, we're covered for that, which I think is a little bit what Wendi and Jaya were talking about. And actually, like, often, are you really aware? Are you sure? And then the opposite end of the extreme is that's not relevant to us. We're not going to be a target. And I think this also ties back to what Jaya was saying, which is like, there is this misconception that attacks have to be targeted. The reality is, like, the vast majority are super opportunistic. And even if they are targeted, often what that means is they've said organizations in this sector or organizations of this size, right? Like, they're not, or organizations in this geography. It's not like targeted as in I'm specifically going after Acme Corp. And so this idea that your organization isn't going to get the notice of attackers is irrelevant, because it isn't about being noticed. It's about somebody in your organization being unlucky enough to get an email and clicking on a link, or something like that, like somebody in your organization's creds being available on the black market. Like, you can fall victim for all sorts of reasons, and it has nothing to do with your organization being specifically targeted. And I think until business leaders understand that, they're not going to provide the support to the operational staff that the operational staff need.
Yeah, and I think one of the, I sort of a version, there's sort of two different versions that I run into of that. One of which, it's not going to happen to us. But the other version is actually a very fatalistic version now. Which is they sort of internalize that message, but now they come at it and like, oh, there's nothing we can do about it. Like, it's all just a matter of luck. Like, everybody gets hacked and there's nothing that we can actually do to make ourselves better off. And that's sort of that I haven't, over the last few years, I've started to see this kind of fatalistic, strain sort of develop. And so while it's true that in theory, you can't stop all attacks, you can't make an organization invulnerable. There are things that you can do to, obviously improve your cybersecurity. So the answer is not at either extreme; it's somewhere in the middle. But given that, what's a realistic goal that a cybersecurity or like an organization's cybersecurity effort should have? What's a reasonable goal there? And I'll sort of, whoever wants to jump on that one first. Jaya, do you want to?
Yeah, I have a future that I'd like to see. And it's kind of, we've talked about this stuff for years, like we want security to be built in rather than bolted on. But the reality is that, of course, that's not happening. Of course, it's not being built in. And the real reason is because the cost of security is not factored in the cost of goods sold, not at all. So if you go and, all these, like, kind of referring back to the previous question, but another like misconception is it'll be secure because I'm moving it to the cloud. So then I'm secure, it's just such bullshit. I'm sorry. It's such malarkey that it's just not a good, thing to do. And but that being said, what I'd like to see in our future is that we actually think about the cost of doing business, include security in there. So roughly 10% of your IT spend should be, and I think it's a really good rule of thumb, 10% of your IT spend should be reserved for cybersecurity, whether that means log monitoring or FTE, whatever that thing costs you to uphold, 10% of it needs to go to security. And there you go.
Yeah, and that's a big number. I doubt many organizations come close to spending that on cybersecurity right now. Yeah.
I think Michael's shocked.
No, go ahead, Jen.
I think Michael's shocked that you're the one that swore, not me. Shocked. And I'm totally taking the word malarkey as a recovery from swearing.
Excellent.
I would say, you touched on it, Michael, right? Like, you're not going to become bulletproof. That's just not a thing. And we always have this like adage that we say in security, there is no silver bullet. Everybody likes to say it over and over again. And then at the same time, we like to give people these like long laundry lists of things that they need to do. And it's overwhelming. It really is. Like, I look at them myself as I'm writing them and think, oh, I'm glad I'm not the person having to implement these. It seems exhausting. And I think the thing for organizations to think about is you're not going to get everything done in that first year, right? Like, that's just not a reality. What you're looking to do is build progress, build a path towards progress. So make it bite-sized, which again sounds like you're trivializing it and saying it's easy, and it's not. Even making it bite-sized is a heavy lift. But if you can identify a path to progress, and your goal here isn't to be bulletproof. Your goal is to make it more inconvenient and more expensive to attack you every year. And if you can do that, and you have to figure out how you're measuring that, which is a whole other question. But if you can do that and you can keep building on, are you more expensive to attack than you were last year? Are you more inconvenient to attack than you were last year? That's progress.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, Jen. And I think that, we are very fond of long lists of, controls, and I don't know what, NIST 800-53 up to for the US government, but it's big. There's a lot in there. But Wendi, you want to add on to this?
Yeah, I think to expand on what Jen and Jaya have mentioned, we look at defining the win by increasing the time that it takes for an attacker to operate against their objectives and decreasing the time it takes for us to detect those actions, right? So clearly we want to prevent as much of the low-hanging fruit as possible, but for so many reasons that have already been mentioned, prevention, right, is not a realistic goal right now across the board. So from that perspective, then how can we take a subset of those activities and make them more timely and more costly for the attacker to conduct at each phase of their operations? And then how can we decrease the timeframes for the good guys, if you will, to respond and detect those activities and then be able to take actions at each one of those steps, right? We're going to assume that one of your users opens a malicious email, right, that contains a link that gives them access to one of their credentials. It's really then, what do we do then? How do we make sure that we can contain that attack as quickly as possible, limit it to that set of actions or credentials that were already taken, for example, and prevent that from being an enterprise-wide attack that involves hundreds or thousands of credentials or systems that are now impacted.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I want to pull on that thread a little bit about time. To me, one of the things we've struggled with in cybersecurity has been our inability to measure cybersecurity, right? Like, it's very difficult to measure the cybersecurity-ness of an organization. But I do think that pulling on time metrics do have some utility, right? Mean time between incidents, right? You want to stretch that out. So that gets at some of the prevention, right? How, and it's not never, right? It's mean time between incidents, because you're going to have them. And then it's like, how fast do you detect it? How fast do you remediate it? I think those time metrics really have a lot of value for organizations, because it starts to tie it to things that they can measure. And you can, Jen, to your point about the building progress, you can actually, you would hopefully be able to see that metric, like the first metric spreads out, fewer incidents, the mean time expands, your time to detection goes down, your time to remediate goes down. But what do we sort of within that, what should people be thinking about in terms of like, what, maybe Wendi, I'll go back to you and just start with this. So what's a good number like for, time for detection and time for remediation?
Yeah, I mean, so internally, we certainly use the 1-10-60 rule as a metric, and certainly a North Star, right? So if we can detect an activity within 1 minute or less, that's going to give us a really increased ability to respond to it. Ideally, we've had the ability to take some sort of action within 10 minutes, right? So whether that action is to isolate a system, to take it offline, to shut down a credential, whatever that action may be, we can take it as quickly as possible. And then to get to remediation within remediation/containment, right, within 60 minutes or less. Those metrics are aggressive, but I think the more organizations we have moving towards those, it's not realistic in every environment by any means today, but if we have the ability, the visibility into the environment to determine when malicious actions are conducted, whom they're conducted by, and then have the supporting evidence, whether that's in the form of logging, other types of data sources that then really give us insight into the specifics of what's the scope of potential access. I don't even think it's so much about the scope of potential compromise, right? It's really just about access. who has unauthorized access into our environment and how widespread is it? Being able to answer that very quickly is going to enable organizations to shut down that malicious activity much faster and really decrease their costs when it comes into looking at the overall cost of breach response, right? It goes up astronomically the more time that we spend doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Pound of prevention is, or detection is worth a lot more than, or is a lot less expensive than the pound of incident recovery or incident response. So, Jaya, on that topic?
Yeah, so I really worry about our numbers sometimes. So the only metric that I've ever explained to a board, for example, is the average time to detect and remediate vulnerabilities and incidents. I put them into one bucket because that average time is a metric that we can look at over time, like how good are we? Because we don't start from the initial detection time, because I feel like sometimes, especially on large complex networks, it doesn't matter so much. It depends if you have a small, well-known network, but on very large networks, including additional customer networks, can be really tricky. So I always try to reconcile how bad we do it. It's always bad, versus like industry averages. And if you take a look in terms of vulnerabilities, like on average in the industry, even for criticals, it takes at least 12 days, if not way longer, to remediate known vulnerabilities. I'm not talking O-Day. I'm just talking about known vulnerability remediation, and that's an average. So, and criticals, from 7 to 10 CVSS scores. And if we take that down to, and that's just vulnerabilities, if we take that down to the average time that intruder is actually within a network, our current average is still 180 days. So that means we clearly don't have like the fighting force we'd need in order to be able to detect these folks in the first place, much less spot, any type of lateral movement or anything else. Like, I think to most organizations, zero trust is still an unknown concept or a sort of vendor sales principle, because we haven't managed to secure and segment workloads, whether that's on-prem or in cloud or whatever. We haven't managed to do that really well. So I'm still really pessimistic. And my future, which again, like, I'm not just going to talk about how shitty it is, but I'd love to see is that we take this metric that we thought about when I was CISO at KPN, which is the potential harm of security incidents. And we gave it a financial number, like a monetary value. What does it mean to the bottom line? If security doesn't always add to the top line growth, what does it mean to the bottom line of the business? And can we actually quantify that and basically audit the heck out of it? Just make sure, I keep using words like heck and malarkey, that's for you guys. So that we know exactly what those numbers are and that we're honest about how bad or good it is. That would be my dream.
No, I think that's actually really important, sort of tying it to the bottom line. That's actually one of my arguments for why I think the financial services industry has actually been a leader in cybersecurity, is because it's actually been easier for them to tie those things to the bottom line, right? Like, I can make this X dollar investment in cybersecurity and I can see this dollar decrease in fraud or loss from cyber incidents. The line is much easier to draw in that industry. Not always easy, but it's easier than in some other industries, I think. Jen, on the metrics piece, any thoughts you want to sort of throw in on there about time and metrics and things?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little bit with Jaya on this. I think, we focus on metrics often on detection and response because it's easier. Which is not to say the metrics are not valuable, they're very valuable, but like when you're responding to an incident, you have a timeline, you have logs that you can look at. And so like you have a way of kind of finding measurement there. In prevention, I think it's way harder to identify meaningful metrics. And this, I think, contributes to the feeling that people have of being on this perpetual hamster wheel and not making progress. And like, there's a real sort of like morale hit that people have of like, you are doing the same thing over and over again every day. You have very little to show for it. Sometimes you feel like you're hard pressed to prove progress. And like, as we all know, another great adage that we like in this community is that, attackers have to get lucky once, whereas security pros have to be lucky every minute of every day. And so like, I think that metrics become important because they are a way of understanding progress and showcasing progress to others. but we struggle so badly on this on the prevention side of the equation. And we look at things like, how many vulnerabilities we've patched or remediated. And we look at things like, how did we do in our last pen test? And have we addressed all the issues? And it isn't that these things aren't important, they are, but they're very incomplete. And we don't really have a good, solid set of metrics to point to say, this is a complete picture of the security program and demonstrates the progress we're making over time. And I think actually, like, this is an area that we need to improve to help people feel like they really are doing something that, we know, us here know how meaningful the work is that security professionals do, but we haven't given them the language to show that to others yet.
I think that's actually a really good point. And I think the other thing that I would just build on that, Jen, is to also say we haven't also started with the, okay, like, so if you're a immature small organization, this set of metrics. Okay, then as you mature, like add these, right?
Yes.
Then as you add these, and then if you're JP Morgan, then you can have these, right? It's sort of
a lot of the dialogue is driven by security vendors, right? And like, hi, I work for a security vendor, so but a lot of the dialogue is driven by security vendors, and we always act as if we're talking to our customers, i.e. the people who can afford to buy our stuff. And so I almost swore, but I didn't. And so, we are not tailoring our message to everybody else. And there is this concept of the security poverty line, which I think is a very real thing. And I do think that there is this extraordinary spectrum of capability and investment, and that we do have to understand what maturity looks like at different levels within that spectrum. So yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. Thank you.
Yeah. So I want to sort of take this and sort of, Jaya, you mentioned the length of time that it often takes organizations to patch or deal with incidents, and my sort of contention is not because those organizations are stupid, right? It's not because the people running them are idiots, right? There are counter incentives and there's counter structures, right, that are preventing that. And so we've got this set of barriers that are out there. And Jen, I'm going to sort of combine this within your point about, like, the cybersecurity industry is often not very good about sort of talking about how to address those barriers directly, right? It's if you just buy the snort flabulator from Acme Company, we will solve all your problems, right? And it'll flabulate those snorts really well, but it doesn't actually, get you down the road. So, like, how should the cybersecurity industry be, admitting that we're still, like, you still need to make money and you need to, provide services, but how should the cybersecurity industry be changing the recommendations that it makes to account for these barriers?
So I'm just going to start, like, I think we have this problem that I like to call the security roller coaster. You kind of get on after an incident or some board member freaking out about some other incident somewhere else. It's when you start riding the roller coaster. And it's awesome when you're riding it up because you get budget and FTE and the attention of the board and stuff, so it's like, woo, it's a party time all the way up. And at a certain point in time, you've reached a plateau because you don't have the visibility of what kind of things you're improving. And it's irregardless of the maturity of the organization, unless there's a regulatory mandate that they have to comply with security requirements continuously, where they can continue to stay on a potential plateau. In the absence of that regulatory requirement, you basically start riding the roller coaster back down. And that means, you have to look at targets on your budget. You have to reduce your FTE for synergy reasons. You have to find ways to be more efficient in terms of your spend, or we are going to move to this new platform or cloud thing. And sorry, there's no budget for security in that, we just can't do it, and figure out another way. There's all of that happening as you ride the roller coaster back down, pretty much waiting for the next incident in order to ride it back up again. So I think that in the absence of the regulatory requirement, this is when, and I don't want to say it, but this specific way to give blame, but it is a blame thing. We haven't actually accommodated for that from a industry perspective. We're really good helping everyone ride the roller coaster up. We suck at how to figure out how to do things more economically when they have to go back down.
It's a really good point. And the economics are always a big driver here. And I think that's a factor that we tend to talk about this all in technical terms, but it really is about the economics, right? And Wendi, I'm sure you see that in what you deal with your customers and clients as well.
Yeah, so I think there's so many angles to approaching this question and the problem. We talk so much about the skills shortage, right, in terms of having people who can do the job. But then when we get to looking at actual CISOs, like to Jaya's point, the average tenure is 18 to 26 months. And 25% of them are only in the job less than 1 year. So we're expecting all of this miraculous change to occur in such an incredibly short time. And then the reality is we're dealing with the human dynamic every which way you go, right? Organizations still make decisions based on sets of processes and procedures. And I'm not saying that those need to be thrown out the window by any means, but when it comes to the reality of how do we successfully defend against attackers that have none of those playbooks or bureaucratic challenges in place, right? They change team, like if we're talking about just a ransomware epidemic right now, these attackers are changing teams nearly, weekly, monthly, changing tools, changing tactics, responding to, some great work that I think is being done to disrupt the infrastructure, but basically regrouping within a couple months and then moving forward with the next set of attacks. And so from that perspective, I think that the way we, expect businesses to deal with these attackers in terms of the way we, deal with just employees, right? And tenure and what the decision-making process is, it can't be that same standard process when we're up against a field that has none of those limitations that we're facing. So I'm challenged by that. I hear everything that you guys are saying in terms of vendors and the shiny new tool and the idea that a tool can solve things. At the end of the day, it's human beings, and attackers are exponentially weighted in the benefits that they have from the pros of the attacks in terms of the money that they're commanding, that's really outweighing what the defense has as a capability today.
I think that's right. And I also think, I think it's sort of the wrong question. I think, yes, I think that the industry doesn't help with this because our motivations are such that we are going to put out a lot of noise and we're going to try and drive people to buy our products, and that helps with the level of confusion and complexity and general distraction. But also it's not actually industry's job to solve this. As much as that sounds like I'm trying to make it somebody else's problem, ultimately it will be our problem, because if we can't figure out how to solve it, we won't make money in the long run. But really, we aren't going to be the solution. When we were doing, and Wendi, thank you for introducing ransomware, because now I get to talk about it without just looking like it's Jen Ellis bingo. But when we did the ransomware task force, the group that I was chairing was the Prepare group, the Prepare working group, which I actually co-chaired with John Davis from Palo Alto Networks. We spent a lot of time looking at, our basic assumption as we came in was that ransomware is not a new topic, and that for the past 5 or 10 years, people have been putting out an awful lot of content telling people how to prepare for ransomware attacks. And so why are people still getting hit every day? Why is this still a thing we're hearing about? So what we wanted to understand was, what are those barriers to adoption? That was our big focus, right? And what it comes down to is that there are a lot of different factors, but they basically boil down to either a lack of true understanding or education, or a lack of ability to respond, right? A lack of ability to invest. And this goes back to what Jaya was saying, right? About that roller coaster that you're on. And, the industry response when on the downswing would be to go, well, you should automate everything and we can help with that. Or, oh, we've got a managed service we can offer you, so you don't need to have full-time staff. By the way, Rapid7 has both automation solutions and managed services. So I'm not saying this is something other people do. We all do this, right? And so, that's how we respond to that, because we're vendors. That's what we're here for, is to make money. If we want to change the capacity for organizations to do things and to invest, then we have to look at broader, more societal solutions. We need to look at Jay mentioned regulation, and I think everybody goes and takes a step back, right? Except maybe not you, Michael, because you work
Correct. So it's less of that, sort of reaction there. Yes.
But like, I think that actually it has a role to play, right? And part of the role it has to play is justifying budget and ensuring that budget is assigned to certain things and creating baselines. And, also there are other things we can look at, like what's being done at the lower end of the market. We talked about the organizations below the security poverty line. How are we supporting them? Do their ecosystem need to do more to support them? Do managed service providers need to do more so we move upstream? Do we need to be providing them grants in some way, or or sticks, right? Like we heard from somebody in local government who said, in local government, we get offered free services by the MSISAC and CISA. But because we don't have bandwidth to use them, to take that up, it gets deprioritized. So it's not even about being given the money, it's about being forced to do it, right? And so their perspective was, hey, we would really like a stick sometimes, not just the carrot, which was kind of shocking to other people in the group to hear. So I think the bottom line of this, and I'm sorry I'm blathering, but the bottom line is, it's really complicated and we are not going to solve it by waving a magic wand. And it's not going to be the case that like tomorrow the vendors are all going to get together and be like, we should message this differently and it will magically be better. There needs to be a much higher level response.
I wonder about that. So let me just put on a devil's advocate for a second. So one of the things that I think really improved the encryption effort on the web was Google pretty much saying, you don't have an S after your HTTP, I'm going to mark you as untrusted. That was a huge amount of power wielded by Google, but actually led to a credible improvement in security. And there's an argument here, and it's just a what if, what if we were able to like lift, the entire community which we support, but then also by agreeing on which things we would do, kind of, yeah. And there was no regulation. So in the absence of regulation, our ability to act collectively could actually meaningfully, look, let me be clear, Avast is a consumer antivirus. There's no companies there, there's consumers there. So you can actually, if you implement change, you can actually effectively roll that out into an entire park of users and like improve their security. That's what Avast tries to do, protect these people that, are under the security poverty line anyway, I don't want to pitch this, but the point I'm trying to make is together, I think we can improve things in the absence of regulatory push.
Yeah, I don't want to rabbit hole us, but just to respond to that, I'm not saying that the private sector can't play a role. I think the private sector absolutely can play a role. And frankly, if you are an infrastructure provider at scale, you can play more of a role than most, right? To use your example. And I think if the private sector does get together, it has enormous power, but you are working against a lot of different incentives and challenges. So it'd be nice to sort it all out ourselves, but I think it's probably unrealistically, I just don't think it's likely to happen very quickly. It'd be nice though.
I think the part that, but the part I even liked about Jaya's example, right, is what made that intervention work, right? It's an economic incentive, right? Because companies don't want to be prioritized. They don't want to have their search results show up as untrusted because they take a hit, right? It also wasn't because Google was just trying to be nice, right? They saw a business benefit in it as well because of driving down some security costs. So again, it's sort of taking that barrier and sort of saying, okay, we understand that it's about the economics and we're going to work within that framework. And Jen, I also agree that that's why the government also has to have a strong policy role in this, because the incentives are not always aligned where they need to be aligned, right? And when you look at the structure, this goes back to Jaya's point that she made earlier, when you look at the structure of the software market, for example, right? The entire structure of the market is first to market, right? Every market incentive, if you're a software vendor, is first to market. Second to market is dead, right? So there is no value in being the second, but more secure version of software? None. And so as long as that incentive structure is in place, we're going to be left with bolting on the stuff, later on, right? And so I think that some of this is also has to be about looking at those market structures. Another, we're actually starting to run up against time here, and there is one question that I did want to actually sort of suss out before we get to the really last question. So, but I wanted to actually talk about, like, what is one piece of feedback that you've gotten from a customer that has surprised you, but actually turned out to be a really important lesson for either you or for your company? So Wendi, you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I think so. We've talked around this term a couple times during this conversation, but the concept of process, people, and technology, right, being interwoven. And I think it's often easy to focus on the people and the technology side, right? And that tends to be where most of the conversation or dialogue goes to. But there was an organization that we worked for had a major breach. And it was actually their second major breach. They had undergone one about 3 years prior to that. And they were a technology company. They had a lot of money. They had made investments in literally all of the best technologies. They had some of the smartest people that our teams had ever worked with. But what they failed to do, they actually kind of over-rotated on, hey, we're going to buy the best tools. We're going to have the best people. And they did that so well that they then thought, well, we don't actually really need to put the processes in place because people are just going to figure it out. Well, they started to have some turnover with people, just not because it was a bad environment, but just because there were some tremendous opportunities out there. And so what it came down to was they had a number of events that occurred that they had detection of, they had the logging of, they could go back and see exactly what had occurred, but no one was regularly checking those systems and that technology for those events. And so when they started, we started investigating, they started unraveling all the pieces, and this was across multiple countries throughout the world. They started noticing, wow, we really have a shortage of just implementable processes that are going to work, that can be repeatable on a daily basis. And I think that one was a bit surprising to me and to our team, just in the sense of saying, wow, these guys, we read the report from 3 years prior. They nearly did everything that was on the list in terms of you need visibility here and you need to detect this and do these things. They follow that playbook, but they failed to then just implement it in a way that it could be handed over from shift to shift and from geolocation to location. And they found themselves in a really big mess because of it. So to me, I think that was a really stunning kind of real world example of the importance of that.
No, that's a fabulous example, and it really, you can't undermine one of those points. The people, the process, and the technology. So Jen, do you want to take this one next?
Yeah, I mean, there's no single thing that stands out in my mind. I guess the thing that I'm constantly mindful of is there's no one customer and there's no one security organization. And you can't make assumptions about what you're going to come across in terms of capability or expectation or interest. And I spend a lot of time talking to people like this, right? And it's awesome. And I get to learn from fantastic people that I talk to every day. And then I talk to a customer who doesn't have any time to tune into things like this, and who, isn't reading constantly the news headlines. And you have to take that step back and go, okay, I live in this sort of rarefied world where I get to sort of exchange ideas all the time with people who have time to do this and whose job it is to do this. And for people who are on the front lines, their world is dramatically different. And we assume a level of knowledge and engagement, which is not to say the opposite, that we shouldn't assume that, just that I think we have to be a little bit more open-minded, and also think about what we're sharing and how we're sharing it in ways that are going to be pragmatic to people, right? We keep bombarding people with information and not making it prioritized and pragmatic for them.
Yeah. Jaya?
Actually, you guys probably have this. We have a security mailing address, for like reporting incidents. And there we get a whole bunch of stuff from customers, like all the things. They come in through this like pipeline because people don't know where to kind of reach us, I guess. And consumers sometimes get really often frustrated because they don't know which of the products in the suite to take. They don't know do I need a secure browser? Do I need the standard AV? Do I need anti-track? And so one of the things that I think is really difficult to do for all, and I'm not just talking about us, but for everybody, is to kind of figure out, how do I package stuff up where I give people a single point of entry, like a security wrapper, if you will, and that they then have, they don't have to figure out which thing they need, but they just get access to everything in one go, because the siloing of all of the things makes it easy for us from a vendor perspective, but it comes really difficult from a consumer perspective. So we've tried to take that advice to heart and make it as easy as possible to be a one-stop shop. But I know that, again, look at our field, look at the disparity and the specialization. It's not easy for someone who doesn't actually know what we're doing to take, some of the advice that we're giving them and to make it like actionable and easy to implement. It's bloody hard.
That's a great segue into my last question as we head here. So, since we've been focused on trying to get to the practicalities of cybersecurity in this discussion, what is that one or set of things you would tell a customer to address pretty quickly, or that practical advice that you would tell them to take their next step in their cybersecurity progress? So what would that be? And Jen, maybe I'll start with you on that score.
Sure. So I think that a lot of security, in order to make progress, you have to get buy-in from your organization. And I don't just mean from your leadership, right? Like, yes, you need to get buy-in from your leadership because they're the people who write your checks. But you also need buy-in from the rest of the organization. If you can create a security forward culture where, I think Jaya mentioned this earlier, where, other people are integrating security into their processes. And this goes back also to what Wendi was saying about the importance of process, right? Like, you are going to be resource constrained in your team. If you can basically leverage resources that exist in other teams, then one, you reduce the burden on your own, and you effectively create a miniature army for yourself. And the way to do that is relationships, right? And I think frequently what happens in organizations is that security ends up being this sort of like thing shoved off to one side. It's not fully integrated in the rest of the organization in perception terms. And part of that is because we have done an excellent job in creating a perception problem for security for years by going, it's super complicated, you don't need to worry about it. You do need to worry about it, you should get engaged, empower people. So the thing I would tell you to do is, next week, look at your calendar, figure out what lunches you have available, and go identify 3 people in your organization that you have never spoken to before, who are in organizations, in teams that you have nothing to do with, that are vastly different to yours. Like choose somebody from the comms team, for example, or marketing, choose somebody from customer support, perhaps, and go build relationships. Because if you start to understand them and what they care about and why they care about it, and they feel the same way about you, you're way more likely to build champions in your organization. And then if you have to deal with a response situation, you're way more likely to be able to work with a team in an effective way. And you're also more likely to be able to do things like get people to tell you if technology is being bought and deployed, and these little things that end up making your life much harder. So my one thing, as ridiculous as it sounds, and as completely off topic of everything else we talked about today as it is go make friends with people, and keep those relationships going, invest in them. You're busy, but you have time for lunch. Go and use those lunches wisely.
Excellent. And actually, I do think it's on topic because this is all about the people, and it's all about the economics, right? It's not about yes, the technology matters, but it is not exclusively about the technology. So, Jaya.
It sounds kind of biblical, but know thyself and know thy network is probably the best advice that I could give anyone. I think the problem is our networks have grown, organically, but also orgasmically with M&A and divestiture and all the other stuff. So actually understanding data flows, understanding what are critical systems and critical processes and critical suppliers is super important. And then you can prioritize efforts, because otherwise we all look really good at just being busy and without actually doing the things that matter. So I think it's about being able to understand IT and understand what's important.
Great, excellent. And Wendi, bring us home.
Yeah, I think that there have been so many great points already covered, but to follow on to Jen's commentary, I think when we look at organizations we worked with that don't do well, right, the bad examples, if you will, out of all of the examples, they have really failed to create a culture where their employees feel empowered to make decisions in critical situations. And that is absolutely fundamental, right? In addition to things like doing the basics well, so many times it's not a security team member who deals with these types of attacks every day that identifies that something's amiss. It is someone in HR or finance or a completely unrelated field, and they need to feel like security is part of their job as well, even if it's not in their title, and that they have the ability to make a split-second decision when needed, or at minimum, be able to escalate it very quickly to their leadership team, who is then empowered to do that. We've seen that happen in organizations who are dealing with fraudulent wire transfers to everything from unplugging a server because of a ransomware or destructive malware attack that's going on. Those kinds of decisions have saved companies millions of dollars, and that's the kind of thing that's a kind of activity and culture that we really want to see created in more organizations.
No, that's excellent. That is excellent. Well, thank you so much, Wendi, Jen, Jaya, for joining me to have this discussion this morning. I really, really appreciate it. I think it's been a great discussion. We, of course, could, just keep going, but I very much appreciate you taking the time and sharing your thoughts and your expertise with us. And with that, we will wrap it up. And I know there are probably some questions that we didn't get to, but we will try to get back to people with some answers to those offline. All right. Thank you very much.